Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbard Gaming. Today I've got something a little different for you. Instead of an utterly pointless comparison between two complete games on different platforms, I decided to mix things up a bit. Today I'm going to give you a mega comparison, in which I'll look at 6 different versions of the first Battletoads game. I'll be checking Battletoads out on NES, Genesis, Game Boy, Game Gear, Amiga OCS, and Amiga CD32, even though those last two are really the same game. If you think putting this video together was easy, well, you're wrong! I'd like to do more of these, but I can't even tell you how many hours I sunk into making this, so no promises. Because I'm looking at so many platforms, I'm going to keep this intro relatively short, and we won't be looking at system specs today. In terms of power, we've got 8-bit versions on NES, Game Boy, and Game Gear. We have 16-bit versions on the Amiga OCS and the Genesis, and technically a 32-bit version on the CD32, except not really because it's just a carbon copy of the standard Amiga version, as so much CD32 shovelware was. The Amiga versions are different, of course, because it doesn't use hardware sprites like the game consoles and portable systems do, at least not in the same way. Anywho, here's a super quick history of Battletoads. Battletoads was developed by Rare and published on the NES by Tradewest in June of 1991. This was at the height of Turtlemania, where Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was really huge in pop culture, and there were lots of copycat-style animal teams. Battletoads, however, is unlike any of the TMNT games out there. While it seems like a beat-em-up at first glance, it's really much more of a memory-based action platformer that focuses heavily on trial and error. It's super hard, it's super frustrating, and honestly not one of my favorites, and I feel like the review scores for this game were way too high back in the day. Ports of the first Battletoads game hit a number of platforms at different times. In 1993, Arc System Works, yes that Arc System Works, developed the game for the Genesis and Game Gear. Rare ported the game to the Game Boy themselves, also in 1993. Note that the title is Battletoads in Ragnarok's world for the Game Boy release, because Rare had already released another game simply titled Battletoads in 1991 that was completely different from the NES version. The Amiga versions, both for the OCS and CD32, were released in 1994, even though they had been developed a couple of years earlier. Now I'll talk about each version in detail during the commentary. As far as recording methodology goes for this video, I used a lot of save states in this one. I'm not claiming to be a Battletoads expert or anything like that, even though I'm not bad at it. I'll keep the original NES version on screen at all times and cycle through the other versions every so often. I'll list which one is on screen at all times. Alright, let's get on with it. And this very special mega comparison is officially underway. So as I mentioned, the NES version will be on the screen at all times. Here you can see it's got a little bit more going on in the intro. We see the ship that the Toads drop down from, and so on. For the Genesis release here, we get a lot more color. We get a parallax layer, so it definitely looks a little bit nicer. I switched to the Amiga version here, and you can see it doesn't look nice. Yes, the specs on the Amiga blow away the NES in most cases. And the fact that Battletoads for it looks so weak is ridiculous, especially the CD32 version with the AGA chipset and a 68020 32-bit processor. The fact that this is what they released for that is insulting. So here we are back to the Genesis version, and you can see this one blows away that CD32 release. Now on the Genesis, everything we see here is a little bit bigger. You know, things move a little bit faster most of the time. There's a little bit more detail and backgrounds and things like that. So overall, it definitely is the nicest looking version of the game we're going to see here today in most instances. Now as I switch over to the Game Gear release, you can see this one is very choppy compared to the NES and Genesis versions, but not on par with the Amiga version when it comes to that. Might even run slightly worse. We'll see a lot more of it. I'll do some longer transitions where you get a longer peek at it as we go along here. This first level is short, so I want to try and get them all in before I finish it. And here we are with the Game Boy release. Yep, and as you can see, they've done a pretty nice job with it. Definitely looks the part. Now we'll switch back to the Genesis version for the first boss here. And every version of this did a pretty good job on this boss. I do like the Game Gear version here, where they did something different and show you sort of the vehicle's perspective, you know, through its AI robotics, trying to point out the Toad in the backgrounds. The Amiga version, looks alright. You know, on that part, it's not too bad. And with that, we are finished with level 1, and on we go to level 2. here you can see for the cutscenes, the Genesis version looks a little bit smoother, looks a little nicer, but overall it's not all that different. It does have a little bit less detail on the panels here, but other than that, it's very similar. So now into the Wookie hole we go. Here we get full parallax layers on the Genesis, so you can see that, the stuff in the foreground overlaps the sort of rocky background tunnel, while on the NES it doesn't. And we'll see several sections here. The Genesis version is going to have much larger enemies. But it's still very similar. The other thing I'll point out here is on the Genesis, you see how easy it is to get one-ups in this part. When you're knocking enemies off the sides, they bounce in a much more predictable pattern, whereas on the NES and some of the other versions, it's a lot less predictable, the angles change. And I don't want to sound like I'm ragging on the NES version too much here. The NES version looks fantastic for the platform it's on. For an 8-bit NES title, it looks and sounds very good. The sound effects are better on the NES version than any of the others, I would say. They have a lot of bass, and those PCM effects are really deep and they hit real hard. For the other releases, sound effects are alright, but I think the NES version definitely takes the cake there. Here on the Game Boy version, it's on par with its little 4 shades of monochromatic, well, green on the real system, but gray here. Could have showed it to you in green, but I hate looking at that, so I went with black and white, and I probably always will when I do these comparisons. So the music from the Game Boy version isn't too bad. It's relatively close to the NES version in most levels. There's only a few that sound, I would say, like really noticeably different. You can see there's a little less flicker on the Game Boy version there than there is in the NES original. So here we are, back to the CD32. We've got sort of a weird smoothness going on with the rocks in the background. And there's also no parallax, no simulated parallax or anything. They just have the entire layer moving at one speed, one layer for the background. So we switch to the Game Gear. We can see the color is pretty nice in this one. And they do have the parallax foreground layer. But the collision detection, especially in this area for some reason, is super weird on the Game Gear. You can hit things when you're very far away from them and not making any actual visual contact with your feet. So we're going to see that there's lots of minor gameplay differences between many of the versions, but that's a pretty big one for the Game Gear here. And with that cramped screen, I know we just switched to Genesis, but with that cramped screen, you do lose some of the room to maneuver that we have in this level in the full screen versions on things like the NES and Genesis. In Genesis especially, you have the largest movement area for the Genesis versus any of the other versions. Alright, now we have these stupid robots that fly around. I hate them in all versions. And the plants, never a fan of the plants. As a side note, I also feel like this level in general, in all versions, is way too long. I think they could have done this level at half of the length, and it still would have felt long enough. And another thing that is really annoying in Battletoads in general is just that it's very, very memorization based, and trial and error. Rare developed this game in such a way that you are going to die, and you are going to die a lot. And the point is you're supposed to learn from that, so when you restart the game next time, you won't die as much in the same places. And it's a tried and true, system of gameplay that is used in a lot of other genres, especially shoot-'em-ups. Alright, so here we are, onto the Turbo Tunnel. The NES version is the only one that does that weird thing with the brain-like stuff in the background. I feel like this is one level where, just visually speaking, the Genesis version trounces all the other ones. Here's the Game Gear. It's got its little Space Invaders coming in. And they added even a little extra parallax that's not in the other versions. Again, it's not real parallax since the Game Gear only has one layer. They are just, using screen splits, or raster effects to render different, tiles and, moving at different speeds on different parts of the screen. So that's how they generate that effect. They do that in a lot of 8-bit titles. The one downside of doing things that way is you can't have things overlap. If you want to have it look like something's overlapping, well, That's where you can use sprites to sort of simulate that effect. Same thing for TurboGrafx/PC Engine games. Alright, here we are on to the speeder bikes. And the Game Gear version is way different than the others here. If you hit one of the walls on the Game Gear, it doesn't kill you. It's not an instant death. You just fall off the bike and you can get back on and start going again. Meanwhile, on the Genesis and NES, the area is basically the same, but it's a little slower on Genesis. And I'm sure this was purely intentional to make the turbo tunnel a little more manageable. Because this is one of the first real pain points in this game where a lot of people would give up back in the day, because it was just so hard. I mean, you really had to both, have good memory and good reflexes to get past it. Here you can see on the Game Boy, they did a nice version with it. It's missing sort of the top layer of scrolling, but again, that's because of the sort of zoomed-in view they went with here, where they made everything bigger. You can see we do have quite a bit of flicker on the Game Boy there in this part. Now, the Game Boy version is still really good, and it's really smooth. The Game Boy and Game Gear versions both came out a little late, hitting store shelves in 1993, as I mentioned earlier, but despite some foibles, particularly on Game Gear, both of them made for an excellent way to play a portable version of Battletoads back then. Each of them offered something different. I mean, just look at what's going on in the Game Gear version right now. These things dropping these posts, walls, are way more aggressive in that version than any of the others. For the Genesis version, it's just, in theory, supposed to be the best-looking version of the game, on the hardware that was typically utilized the best of all the versions covered here. You'll notice there's no footage of the Amiga version for this level, and that's because, well, this level does not exist in the Amiga version of the game. Instead, they went with something completely original where you're flying a different kind of vehicle, more like the one you fly in the Volkmire's Inferno level that we're going to see later on. So what I'm going to do is when I'm done showing you all the versions that are similar, I will switch over to the Amiga version, give it, a little bit of exclusive time so you can see what that one looks like here. You can see even as we speed up, the NES version still moves faster than the Genesis version. And don't be fooled, just because the Genesis version's a little bit slower here, it's still really hard. You're not going to make it, through on your first time if you don't know the patterns of how all those walls come out. Alright, so here is the Amiga version of the game. And yeah, they added this super weird flying level where they just used the droning intro part of the level 3 music from the NES version, and they never switched to, the Turbo Tunnel song. Would have made a lot more sense to use the longer Turbo Tunnel song, for the length of this level. And this level, I mean, it's pretty long on the Amiga, but it's not that bad. Still, it is not very compelling. You're not going to especially enjoy it, but, I mean, it's something different. If you want to play a weirdo version of Battletoads with something you haven't seen before, well, there's your opportunity. Alright, and on to the Ice Cave or Ice Cavern we go, depending on which version of the game you're looking at. Same level, different name. It's another very annoying level. It's easy to take hits here, especially from things off-screen in every version of the game. Well, I haven't talked much about the music yet. I really feel like the music in the Genesis version is a cut above all the other ones. Even though there's some things that are very, iconically NES in that version of the game, I do think the music on the whole sounds noticeably better on the Genesis release. For the Amiga version here, music's tolerable, but going back to visuals, once again, it's the only version of the game that doesn't have any kind of parallax layer. As we switch to the Game Gear, this level is incredibly frustrating in the Game Gear version of the game. Why? When you're going up these hills, it's easy to get stuck on walls and things like that, and the ice physics in the Game Gear version are just extra weird. They don't feel like the ice physics in any of the other versions. They're especially difficult to manage. Now, for the Game Boy, it's alright. You can see, reasonable facsimile of the NES version, just reduced to 4 shades of, green on the original or gray in this video. So as you make it into roughly the second half of the level here, you can see the Genesis version definitely looks better than the others. We have more colors, that parallax layer, is full. Everything, can fully overlap. We don't see any weird artifacts from areas where it's cut off like on the NES. but it is a little weird that the spikes are so small. And when we get up to this part here, the moving platform's a little bit smaller and a little bit faster. And that one snowball there is about the biggest piece of garbage move that I've seen in Battletoads. Here we are back in the Amiga version. In this version, I should mention for the controls, you only get one button. So how the heck do you play this one? Well, if you stand still, the button attacks. If you press the button while you're moving, it jumps. In strictly 2D levels, like the ice cavern here, you can also jump with up, as you could in many Amiga platformers. Now in modern times, if you want to have a better experience, you can set the up position to one of your buttons on a control pad, via an emulator. The one thing that I find that there's really no excuse for is on the CD32 version of Battletoads. The CD32, still generally just an Amiga 1200, packed into a console-style case. It uses a 4-button controller. With that 4-button controller, you still don't get a jump button. You still gotta use the same control method as a standard Amiga. That's kind of unforgivable in a thing like this, if you ask me. We've been listening to the NES version a little bit. We're going to switch to the Genesis one in just a moment. Here we are. I'll shut up for just a moment so you can hear it a little bit. Alright, so back to commentary here. Now for some versions, you'll notice the snowball patterns are a little bit different here. So, especially on the Amiga release, it's way different. And this falling platform, once again a lot smaller on Genesis. I feel like it moves maybe a tinge faster there. And this part, wow. This part where the spiky shell things hit the walls to bounce them up and down, in the Game Gear version, which we're looking at now, very difficult also. Probably the most frustrating aspect of this entire level. Even worse than the part where you have to go up all those hills. Why is it so bad on the Game Gear? You've got to jump like way in advance to time your jumps to get underneath those walls. Also a pain in the Amiga version, by the way. But anyway, we can put level 4 behind us. You'll notice they don't always say the same things. The Queen sometimes says different stuff. This guy sometimes says different stuff. Depends on the version of the game, whether they're going to say the same thing or something different. If there's an element of randomness there, I don't know, so there might be. That's something I really should have researched before recording this one. Sorry about that, folks. You can see on the Genesis version here, as we're on the surfboard area, you can't control like jumping on the surfboard. It happens automatically on both the NES and Genesis. Those logs on the Genesis are a lot bigger, and the slant of the angle is a lot different. On the Genesis, we also get, a full parallax layer here. What you're going to really see in a moment is that on the Game Gear version of this, which we'll switch to shortly, there we are, it's actually quite a bit different. You can control the jumping with a button in the Game Gear version, so you can jump whenever you want. They also have different enemies and different kinds of fights here than we see in the other ones. Like here on the Game Gear, you're fighting those giant legs that we see, come up for the level 1 boss. You don't do that in any other version. And switching back to the Genesis, you can see we have real nice shading on some of the, rocks and stuff on the wall in the background. We have slightly better shading on the logs that are all set up here that we walk on in this section. And then here we have the same boss in both, and you can see he's noticeably bigger and wider on the Genesis release. But hey, we're gonna just pound him to death in both versions here by hitting him with a stick over and over. I do also like the Genesis version better for, the stick when you're using it as a weapon, since it reaches further and goes out more horizontally. And here we are back on the surfboard. We'll switch back to the Game Gear version for a moment here. Sound on the Game Gear version, by the way, weakest of all the versions, as you can hear. Here we've got a little bit more going on with it, with logs that move around and jump points, that, ramps that are in different spots. Switch back to the Genesis here, which is almost one-to-one, with the NES version. There's barely anything that's different here. We're heading towards the end of this level. You can see on the NES, it speeds up a lot on this part. On the Genesis, it just runs at a consistent speed here, and it's kind of slow. And it's not that that part is much harder with the speed on the NES, so I don't really know why Arc System Works didn't speed it up. So here we are now, switched over officially to the Amiga 500 version. And we don't have the surfboard level on the Amiga version. Instead, we're on a jetpack and we're flying up in this area that's sort of like a blue-tinged version of the Wookie hole. This level's not too bad. It's alright. There's not a lot of enemies in it. It's mostly avoiding background obstacles. You do have to be careful in it. Very easy to hit spikes. But let's move on. They did keep the grabbing a piece of tail line. Gotta make sure that's in both versions. Alright, so here we are with the snakes. The snakes are a little bit smaller, but a little bit smoother in the Genesis version. Kind of surprised on the Genesis they're not using a parallax layer for the background here, and it's just one background. And this is another area in the game where it is 100% memorization. You can anticipate where a lot of the snakes are going to come out, just based on where you end up, but it's not always where you're going to expect. So now let's switch over to the Game Boy version for a bit. Snakes are smaller and thinner in this one, but the patterns of movement are still basically the same. Things also are a bit slower in this Game Boy version, and, that was to compensate for the blurry screen that the Game Boy had, so people would be able to see what was going on while scrolling was happening. If you've never seen real original Game Boy hardware, it would get quite blurry when it was scrolling. And here's the Amiga version, which they did stick very close to the original. The colors don't match it so well for the snakes and things like that, but the snake patterns are pretty much identical to the NES release. So here we are on Game Gear. For Game Gear, they really decided to go their own way with this one. The snake patterns are different, the areas are different, the layouts are different. So they're really doing their own thing here. There's one in particular, which is this one here, that you really got to be on your toes for. There's parts you're going to have to transfer straight from one snake to another while you're holding on to the side of it. And I kind of like it. I kind of like the difference there. Old-time Battletoads fans may not be a fan of the fact that they changed, the layout of how the snakes work and everything, but I do like seeing something a little bit different here. They also have nice colors in the backgrounds. Kind of makes up a little bit for the choppiness, but not entirely. I would have rather had it be a little bit smoother. Alright, so here we are back on the Amiga version. And you can see once again, it lines up pretty well with the NES original. Not a whole lot left here. There we are, switching back to the Genesis version. Again, it lines up very well with the NES original. And here I'm going to show you something pretty cool. I don't even see a lot of speedrunners do this. You can take a shortcut here to get to the end of the level and skip riding the snake a bit. And it works both on the NES and Genesis. It's easiest to pull off on the NES, it's tougher to do in the Genesis version. Now one other thing I'll note there about the NES versus Genesis release is you also notice the Genesis one is full screen, so the UI elements on Genesis are layered on top of the game screen. On NES you have that black bar at the top. I don't care too much about the black bars, but some people care a lot about that stuff. Now here's an interesting case. For the Amiga version of this level, they kind of took the graphics from the Turbo Tunnel, but the enemy layouts and everything else is taken from, Volkmire's Cavern. So this is going to be the fire level. It's going to change on the Amiga, but that's how it starts out. So I just wanted to show that to everybody to begin with here. On the Genesis, you can see we get, again, nicer colors, better shades. Oddly enough, we don't have, any parallax scrolling for all the crystal-like things in the background. So in this one, the NES version ends up looking a little bit more advanced. I don't know why they cut that out of the Genesis release. Would have been real easy to include. That headbutt is probably the best move in the game for disposing of regular enemies for the vast majority of it. There come those infernal space invaders. Now here's something that you probably weren't expecting. Check out the Game Gear version here. Here we've got 3 parallax layers, and we've got animated fire. Most other versions have much simpler patterns for fire in the background. Some of them are color cycling. On the Genesis version, you're gonna see there's nothing, it's just there. And the only other version with any semblance of animation for the fire is actually the terrible Amiga version. I don't know why they went all out with the Game Gear version, especially on this level, but hey, nice job. But it had a smoother frame rate. This would easily be the best looking version of this level in any version of the game. So we're almost up to the part where the fire will start on the NES. There we are. And there it is on Genesis also. Now on NES, we get simple color cycling to make it look like the fire's glowing. On the Genesis, they don't even do that. But on the Genesis, we do have that upper level of line scrolling waviness that is bigger than what we see in the NES release. So there's that. And this is another part that on NES will get to be a little bit faster than the other versions. And you will see that as this part goes on a little bit. It's another part where they just tone things down a smidge on the Genesis. So the Amiga version does have some simple animated fire, but it does not look as good as the Game Gear version. And I will give you a kind of funny side note here. For the Genesis version, if you're playing on an emulator with Run Ahead, it totally messes up this level. You gotta shut Run Ahead off. And what is Run Ahead? If you're not familiar with that with emulators, it sort of, reads a frame or two in advance and uses save states to go back and sort of read your mind, basically, to make it look like you're pressing, a control button or a direction earlier than you did. So it compensates for the control lag introduced by a lot of emulators. This is another part where if you have Run Ahead on the Genesis, the missiles will kind of disappear and reload because of the way Run Ahead works. By using save states and reloading them quickly, it just messes everything up. So I guess they're doing a lot of random timing based on animation frames. Here we are on Game Gear again, and I will point out on Game Gear here, aside from having the nicest background, this is another part where they've made it inherently more fair than the other versions. Hitting things does not instantly kill you in this section. So you'll take damage and you'll just keep on going. You can take a few hits before you die. So if you're looking to play the most fair version of Battletoads, well, the Game Gear version is probably it. So while things do speed up a lot here on Genesis, it's not quite as fast as the NES version. Still really fast, but it's also easier to maneuver and align the ship with the holes here. And I will say, speaking of Run Ahead, after I explain what that is, on the NES version, there are parts of it I just couldn't do on an emulator without enabling Run Ahead, but there were no weird, Run Ahead side effects in that version of the game. Alright, so here we are, going up the stupid tower. Very long level. This is one where on the NES they do some things that are nicer on that version than the Genesis again. We have more, simulated parallax than we have actual parallax versus the Genesis one. Also on NES, you can tell which one of these moving platforms, which ones have, lightning in the gaps. They have, different colors. They're yellow on the end. On the Genesis, you don't have that. They all look the same, so you don't know which ones, are going to have lightning bolts in them and which ones aren't. You'll also see that there's just more background detail on NES here. It's pretty much like from this point on, the developers at Arc System Works, I don't know, maybe got a little lazy, stopped caring about their work as much, or running out of memory on the cartridge, which is hard to believe. Here on the Amiga, this is one version that actually doesn't look too bad here. While I'm not a fan of dithering, as you know, this isn't too bad. While it stinks that, once again, we have no parallax and things move a little bit on the choppy side, the detail in the backgrounds is pretty nice. So in a still shot, you would think this one looks alright. But playing it, yeah, it's super choppy. And one thing I really need to stress is the speed on that Amiga version is really inconsistent. It speeds up and slows down quite frequently while you're playing, depending on how much is on screen. There we have the annoying feds. Again, you can see we have more of that simulated parallax layer on NES. No parallax in this section on Genesis for some reason. You can see more examples of what I'm talking about there, with the moving platforms and being able to tell which ones will have lightning in them on NES, but not on Genesis. Another weird change that I don't get why they made that. And that black frame that you saw on NES, that's no weird cheating. That was just a glitch that happened during emulation. Alright, here's our boss for this level. This one is hardest on NES versus the other versions. Oh, and I do want to also point out that this level is not in either of the portable versions of the game. So you won't see this in the Game Gear or Game Boy, which is why you haven't seen that footage here. They didn't replace it with anything, they just cut the levels out. So here, I mean, the boss in some ways is actually easiest on the Amiga version. He can still flatten you, but he's less likely to flatten you when he lands on you. For the Genesis version, I find it's easier to juggle the boss, because he falls slower, so it's easier to get to him after you land a hit on him. On NES, he comes down a lot faster. There you can see some nice juggling action on the Genesis. And I think I finish him off that way. Yep, there we go. And there he is, fully taken down in both versions of the game. Alright folks, I know this is a long one, just a few levels left. So this is another incredibly annoying level. It's another one that relies heavily on trial and error. Your first few times through this, you will die a lot, and it's just brutally unfair. It's also another one where I feel like on Genesis they really kind of phoned it in compared to some of the work they did on the earlier levels. The water animation does not look as good on Genesis as it does on NES. There's a little less going on at some times in the backgrounds. It just looks like they cared less, as I said, about that level than earlier ones. And that's something we're going to see all the way through the end. Then on the Amiga version here, it looks alright. Again, it's got a bit more detail in some ways than the NES original, but it is slower and choppier, and they did go with a weird color palette. It looks a lot different. So here we are back to Genesis, and you can see the whole thing just looks very plain. I mean, it looks very much like a very early Genesis release, rather than one that came out after the system had more than found its footing, over the course of several years. So here we are back to the Amiga. There were some very minor layout changes here on the Amiga one. It's mostly the same. But you'll notice it if you have a close eye on it, as the footage goes through here. Now we're back to Genesis. I also am not a fan of that flashing water effect. Hopefully it's not giving any of you a seizure. I should probably have warned you about that. And Rare really went out of their way to be jerks by putting a lot of enemies beyond those pieces of pipe to obscure them. Pure jerk move, they wanted you to die, they wanted you to just run into things. So it's like for every section of this level, in every version of the game, you've got to take it very slow and be very careful. Now I should also point out on the Amiga version here, it's really a pain when it comes to controls on this level. For when you're swimming, you have to hold up and tap the button in order to swim. If you don't hold up while you're doing it, you don't swim and you'll end up just falling and probably dying. Now you can get used to it, but it's something you really gotta train your brain for. Here, I'll just let you listen to some of the musical differences again, so I'm gonna shut up for just a moment here as this level goes on. Alright, so let's continue here. The rubber duckies. Super annoying enemies in every version of the game, except maybe the Amiga one where they're super easy to headbutt. In the Genesis and NES releases, you can't really land headbutts on them when they're approaching you, so you gotta be really careful and hit them, otherwise they will go wild and just viciously attack you. So what I think they really should have done on the Genesis here was added a lot more to the background. Why not have, maybe a little parallax effect from when you're in the water, or at least maybe something else in the background and make it a little bit wavy. Something tasteful that's not very distracting. There's so much they could have done to add a little bit more to this one and make it look better. It's not bad in the pantheon of NES to Genesis ports or conversions. I'd even say it's generally on par with what you could expect out of most of them. However, there's no question that more effort could have gone into making it look a little nicer. More background details and effects could have been added, and a little more care could have just gone into it in general, especially in the last few levels here. Alright, here's a stupid rat race level. Not a fan of this one. It's also got by far the most annoying song in the entire game. Once it gets going, it just sounds like a droning siren that just doesn't stop until you hit the end of the level. And it also has a pretty short loop point before it replays that siren part. You'll hear when we get there. And you'll thank me for keeping the music a little bit low during the commentary. Again, you can see the background on the Genesis version in so many places is just very plain compared to the NES one. Less going on, less details. And back with the Amiga here, you can see it looks similar to the level where we're going up the tower. So it looks alright, but we don't have any of the parallax or anything. I should also note here, gameplay-wise, in the NES and Amiga versions, it's pretty easy to hit the rat. On the Genesis version, I'm not even entirely sure you can. It looks like when you hit him, nothing happens. But it is easier to just go down and win the race on the Genesis version than it is in the NES original. Same for the Amiga. You can see on the Amiga there, I made it with a ton of extra time. And this is the last section of this area. You can see that the layout is slightly altered by the big gaps between the girders in the Genesis release versus the NES one. Not a huge deal, but it does feel a little different. And man, does that rat take off in the Genesis release. Now on the NES one, you can see here, I'm going to hit the rat a whole bunch of times, and it's practically necessary. If you just try and run to the bottom and race him, it's very, very difficult to actually get there first. So at least for me, I'm not good enough to do that if it's possible. I have to nail him a few times to slow him down before I head down myself. On the Genesis release, since you can't really do that, I can just head down and I'm going to beat him there. On the Amiga version, this part is actually really easy. It's way easier than any of the other ones. Oh, and once again, you'll notice for both the last level and this one, they are not in the Game Boy and Game Gear versions, which is why you haven't seen them in a little bit. But don't worry, after this level, after this boss fight, we will return and show all versions of the game again. So here on NES, for some reason, very often, the boss will start out completely motionless and just not go after you. But then he usually does start moving. I've had times, though, where he barely moves a step. And if you're pretty good, you can juggle him, but I chose to go the safe route here, because I wanted to win the fight in the smallest amount of time possible without having to constantly redo things. You can see I had a much easier time on the Genesis. For the most part, I mean, he gets faster, but he doesn't get faster, and build up speed as quickly in that version as he does on the NES. And it seems like his overall top speed is quite a bit slower than the NES original. Here's the fight on the Amiga, and man, does it look particularly silly on the Amiga. And it's all about the headbutts in the Amiga version of the game. If you try doing this, in this way on the Genesis or NES, you're going to get hit and you're going to take damage. On the Amiga version, it's almost entirely safe to use the headbutt over and over. And usually from pretty far away. Another thing you'll have noticed here is that the NES version plays the boss music on pretty much every boss fight. On the Genesis version and the Amiga version, we often just hear the regular level music playing during the boss fight, but that boss fight is in the Genesis version of the game. We hear it at certain points, just not most of the time. And oh boy, this level is the bane of my existence. When I was talking about Run Ahead on NES, I could not finish this level in the NES version of the game on an emulator without enabling Run Ahead. Just the control lag when going around these corners, the split second of lag that was in there, was too much for me to be able to do it. I spent probably about 2 hours trying to do it before I gave up and turned Run Ahead on. Now on the Game Gear, it's a lot easier. On the Genesis, it's a lot easier. Every version is a lot easier than the NES original. That stupid swirly thing gains on you so fast in that version of the game that you have pretty much zero room for error. Meanwhile, every other version of the game, it's easy to build up a huge lead where it can never really catch you unless you make a giant mistake. And interestingly enough, the layout for every version of this level is pretty much identical. Like on the Game Gear, how they have sort of an added, simulated parallax layer. It doesn't move, but you've got no movement on one layer versus the foreground versus the NES, which has sort of animated tiles. On the Genesis version, look at all this black screen here. This is what, I was talking about with getting lazy at the end. It looks like there's supposed to be a parallax layer behind this. I can't believe that made it into the finished version of the game. It just looks incredibly weak and sloppy. And fighting the swirl is quite a lot different in every version of the game. It's most similar in NES and Genesis, but every other version feels way different. And man, look at that choppiness in the Amiga version. The Amiga version, again, once you get him down, you can just headbutt it till it dies. And you will not have a problem doing that. On the Game Gear, after you hit it and it takes damage, it flashes like that for a split second, and then you gotta wait and perfectly time hitting it again. If you don't time it right, if you're lucky, you'll just miss like I did there. Other times, it will just attack you. And on Game Boy, you gotta be a little more careful, but again, it's a little more NES-like. And they added this weird, animated tile to simulate a weird parallax layer during the boss fight. Not quite sure why that's there. You'd think that would have been still and motionless since we're not actually moving here. And then on Genesis, once again, you can see we just are subjected to that plain black background, and it's so ugly. I don't know why they did that. There we are, finally beat the stupid swirl. And let me just say that it is 100% evil to have this boss fight at the end of that level, especially in the NES original. We're talking pure insanity, and Rare just apparently hated your guts. There he is, down on Game Gear and down on NES. Alright, and guess what? We are heading into the final level of Battletoads. And it's a doozy because it's super long. It really is crazy how long Battletoads is. This is a game that on NES, Genesis, and Amiga has either 12 or 13 levels depending on how you count them. I think they could have, easily gotten by with maybe 7 or 8, especially with some that feel a little too similar to each other. Particularly, going up the tower and then going down it in Rat Race. And here we are in Game Gear. You can see the tower looks entirely different. Use a different color scheme. It's got, different shapes. It's got a completely different layout for the level itself. Different obstacles. Things appear at different times. Meanwhile, on Game Boy, it sticks almost exactly to the NES version. Same for the Genesis. And it's similar on the Amiga, but on the Amiga they also do go their own way a little bit. And when we get to the Amiga version in a split second, here we are, you can see the effect of the rotating tower even looks quite a bit different. And it's not too bad despite the low frame rate. Still kind of a cool-ish effect. It's also painfully slow on the Amiga. When we look at the speed on, say, the NES and Genesis versions compared to the Amiga, it is hard to play this version after those. And how did I record this video? Well, I played that version after the NES and Genesis ones, so it was not a fun playthrough. Here on Genesis, again, like I said, we pretty much match the NES layout exactly, but the tower looks a little nicer and we have a bigger variety of colors and stuff in it. Those enemies, you give them a chance, you saw in the NES there, they open their big giant mouths and just eat you whole. And it's another one-hit kill. And let me talk about that for a second here, because I haven't talked about it enough during this video. There are so many one-hit kills in Battletoads, it makes me wonder why they even bothered to include an energy bar. So many things will just completely destroy you with the lightest touch. If you fall into a pit, you die. If you touch a spike, you die. If you get eaten by those guys with the big mouths, you die. In this level, if you get blown away by clouds, you die. Doesn't matter how much energy you have, you just die. And while I can understand that in game design to a degree, I feel like this game just very much abuses it on that system. Well, basically on that system and the Genesis, NES and Genesis, I would say. It's less of a problem on Game Gear because there are fewer things that kill you in one hit, even though, there are still things that will get you. Such as falling off of the tower here. And on the Game Gear, this part's super annoying. It's like using the blocks in Mega Man, except they're entirely random. They can pop in at completely different points every time you play. So there's no set pattern to learn, that one is all reflexes and skill. We're headed towards the end here. Still a little bit more to go. You can tell once you get to that skinny part of the tower, there's not going to be a whole lot left. Things are pretty nice once more in the Game Boy, even though we're dealing with that monochromatic palette. I can admire the job that Rare did on that. I'll be quiet here for a little bit to let you listen to some music again. Alright, so I'm back. Here we are with the part where the big cloud tries to blow us away in these two versions of the game. Something that's not in every version. I have to say, I can't see how this tower would be structurally very sound, especially with all these skinny little parts, especially with some that are aligned to the left or right side of it. But oh well, that's bad guy design for you, I guess. I can't tell you enough how difficult it was to make this video. As you know, and as I've told you, Battletoads is a hard game, and I played through it completely on all of these platforms. I'd been through it quite a few times before, but it's been a long time since I played it, and I had to train myself in it again before I even thought about recording it. And then with recording it, there's so much random weirdness that can happen in this game. Save states were necessary for a few reasons. One is I tried to keep it where I'd be able to sync gameplay up in some parts so I could have the same things on the screen, in more than one version at a time. And just, even then, it still wasn't even possible on all of them. You can see on the Genesis, I already finished the tower. Meanwhile, on NES, still making my way up. Here we are on Game Gear again. Looks almost like a reverse Big Top circus tent. Here we are, fighting the Queen. And check out the Queen here in the Genesis version of the game. She's a little bigger in certain ways, don't you think? Anyway, you can see once again, on NES, we have sort of that weird parallax background that's just kind of moving around, just animated tiles. On the Genesis, there's nothing, but we do have the curtains. On the Amiga, it looks like we're more in the control center of the ship than, say, at the top of the tower. So this would have made sense for the ship. I'm not sure it makes sense for the top of the tower. Game Gear is sort of a mix of the NES and Genesis versions, except it uses much smaller squares for the part in the foreground. And then, for Game Boy, it's pretty much just a cut-down version of the NES one. I do find the Queen's animation a little hilarious. Reminds me very much of Terry Gilliam animation. I don't know especially why in, say, the Genesis version, they didn't add more frames to that. Hard to believe they wouldn't have had the memory space left over to do something like that. And then, of course, because Rare hates you, after you kill the Queen, if you didn't know, she comes back up from the center and hits you. So, if you die there, that's very unfortunate, and you may have to do the whole fight over, or who knows, maybe that'll be the end for you and you'll just turn it off. But finally, our long nightmare is at an end. There we've saved our fellow Toad, and the princess we were looking for, because there's gotta be a princess, right? Now the NES has a longer ending. The Genesis version, we get that, we get this screen, and that's it. Then we get the Sega logo. So I wanted to show you the princess and the Toad coming down on the Amiga version, but with a much different color for the Toad. I actually think the princess looks better on the Amiga one than she does on Genesis. And then for Game Boy, we once again have a very cut-down ending. It's got the picture of the Dark Queen, at the beginning there. And then we have this text, which is pretty much the same from the NES version. But it does play different music here. And guess what? That is finally it. Alrighty, so there you go, technically 6 versions of Battletoads compared. So what are my key takeaways after subjecting myself to 6 different versions of this insanely hard game? Let's start with which version is best. Overall, I'd probably go with the NES version. It's the most refined in terms of mechanics and is the most visually impressive for the hardware that it's running on. Yes, it's maddeningly difficult. Yes, it's incredibly unfair. But at least they really push the hardware with it. The collision detection is a bit wonky in all versions, and that includes the NES one. And really, I think which version is the best is a bit of a toss-up between the NES original and the Genesis/Mega Drive release. But I'm gonna give the NES version a slight edge just because they clearly tried harder with this version than any of the others. And yes, I know they were done by different developers, as I mentioned in the intro. Let's move on to the 16-bit Sega release. It mostly looks better than the NES original. It sounds quite a bit better. Some of the most egregiously unfair parts of the NES original have been sanitized a little in the Sega version, even though it's still very difficult. The problem here is that a few parts of this one are just a little bit sloppy, and it looks like Arc System Works gave up on the backgrounds for the last few levels, with plain black areas that look like they were supposed to have a parallax layer that just never got added. If a little more had been done to enhance the Genesis release, it would have easily been the best version. But Arc opted to go for a mostly one-to-one conversion, where they maybe half-assed it a bit at the very end for some reason. Next down the list is probably the Game Boy release. This one was from from Rare itself. Sure, it cuts a few levels out, things are zoomed in, and it feels a little off compared to the NES original when it comes to gameplay, and shows less on the screen at one time. But it is smooth, and it provided a reasonable gameplay experience for a monochromatic portable version of Battletoads. I can't tell you there's much reason to play this one today, other than maybe a healthy dose of curiosity, but it is well done considering the limitations of the original Game Boy hardware. The Game Gear release is a bit of an odd duck. Also done by Arc System Works, it runs at a drastically reduced frame rate compared to the other versions, and is the least refined version of the Japanese console releases in this video. Despite the fact that Arc cut a few levels, they made some interesting changes, and some parts of this version stand out as more impressive than any other version of the game, such as the animated fire in Volkmire's Inferno. Reducing the amount of one-hit kills was another welcome change they made to this one, especially in the Turbo Tunnel. It's still a hard game, but it's a more reasonable one. So which portable version is best? That's a tough call. If you want a more NES-like experience, then it's the Game Boy one. If you're up for something a little bit different that's maybe a little less frustrating to play through, then you might actually like the Game Gear version better. Finally, bringing up the rear, we have the Amiga versions. The OCS, its original chipset, and CD32 releases are for all intents and purposes the same game. It takes zero advantage of the AGA chipset inside the CD32. Amiga Battletoads isn't a good version of the game. Vertical movement is painfully slow, the frame rate is terrible, the one-button controls kinda suck, and overall it's a really janky version of the game that doesn't even always run at a consistent speed. The replaced levels in the Amiga versions give them a little bit more flavor, I guess, and some of the music is okay, but unless you're an absolute Battletoads fanatic, you really don't need to play these versions. Alright folks, so tell me, what did you think of all of these versions of Battletoads? Which version is your favorite? Which one did you like the least? Which one ruined your childhood with its insane difficulty? Tell me all about it in the comments. And also tell me if you'd like to see more videos with this format. So that'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed it, please like and share it online somewhere. If you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss any of my videos. If you want to support the work that I do here, you can do that on Patreon, Ko-fi, or right here on YouTube through channel memberships. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.